Your destiny is preserved in the amber glow of the choices you make today, waiting to be revealed in time. Explore the powerful narratives of fate and the lessons that define who we are destined to become. Click subscribe now and start building your own eternal legacy with us. I was driving back from the buyer's meeting with a cashier's check for $2,800,000 folded inside my jacket pocket, thinking about how I would tell my son the news over dinner when I made the mistake of coming home 40 minutes early. The side door to the kitchen was unlocked, the way it always is when my son and his wife are visiting. I stepped inside quietly, not wanting to startle anyone, and I heard them at the dining room table, not arguing, not laughing, planning. Calmly, methodically, the way people talk when they believe no one is listening. I stood in the hallway with a check worth nearly $3 million pressed against my chest, and I listened to my son explain to his wife exactly how they were going to take everything I had built over 30 years. I want to tell you this story from the beginning. Not because it gets easier in the telling, but because the beginning matters. It explains who I was before that afternoon. It explains why I didn't walk into that dining room and confront them. It explains why I turned around, walked back out the side door, sat in my truck, and started thinking like the investigator I used to be. My name is Walter Greer. I am 68 years old. I spent 22 years as a fraud investigator for the Oregon Department of Justice before I retired at 53 and turned my full attention to the only other thing I had ever loved as much as the work, my restaurant. Not a fancy place. A diner, technically, though we never called it that. Greer's, on Morrison Street in Portland, 42 seats, open at 6 in the morning, closed at 3 in the afternoon, breakfast and lunch only, because I decided early on that the dinner crowd required a version of hospitality I wasn't willing to perform. My late wife, Linda, started the menu. I ran the books. For 30 years, that place fed people, paid its debts, and put my son through college. My son. I need to stop calling him that as if the word still means what it used to mean. He is 41 years old. He works in finance, though the specifics of what he actually does have always been vague enough that I stopped asking years ago. He married his wife 6 years ago. She is pleasant at holidays. She always remembers to ask about my knee. I believed, until the afternoon I stood in my own hallway with my heart sliding toward the floor, that she genuinely liked me. The buyer who purchased Greer's was a young couple from Seattle who had been looking for an established breakfast spot with an existing customer base. We had been in negotiations for 4 months. The final number, $2,800,000, was more than fair. It was more than I had ever expected to see in one place in my lifetime. The check was real. The closing was done, and I was 68 years old, recently retired for the second time, and thinking about what Linda would have said if she could have seen it. She would have said, "Call your son. Tell him first." I was going to. I parked on the street instead of pulling into the driveway, the way I always do when I'm only stopping briefly. Old habit. I came in through the kitchen side door because it's closer and I'd given them a key years ago, and the door is never locked when they're inside. I was going to pour myself a glass of water, sit down at the table and tell my son that the sale had gone through. Instead, I heard his voice before I reached the kitchen. He was speaking in the measured, unhurried tone he uses when he has already thought something through and is now simply explaining it to someone slower. I recognized that tone. I had used it myself. In interview rooms, when a case was already built and the only task remaining was presentation. "We need to move before he changes his mind about the will," my son said. "He's been talking about setting up a charitable trust. Linda's people. Cancer research. If he does that before we file, we lose half of it at minimum." His wife said something I couldn't hear clearly. "He has $2.8 million sitting in a personal account by tomorrow morning," my son said. "And no one to answer to. No business, no employees, no obligations. He'll start giving it away out of grief and guilt and whatever else is rattling around in that head of his. We have a window. It closes fast." I pressed my back against the hallway wall and breathed through my nose. How he knew about the sale number stopped me for a moment. Then I remembered. 3 weeks ago, my son had visited on a Sunday. I had left my laptop open on the kitchen counter while I went to check something in the garage. The buyer's most recent offer had been on the screen, an email I had been drafting a response to. I remembered coming back inside and finding him standing near the counter, not close enough to be obviously reading, but close enough. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I thought about it now. His wife's voice rose enough for me to catch the edges. What about the will? Doesn't everything go to him automatically? Not if we establish that he's not competent to manage it, my son said. His voice was patient, almost gentle, the way you explain something to a child. The restaurant sale is actually perfect for this. He's been under significant stress. The loss of the business, Mom's death 2 years ago. He's isolated. He drinks wine alone on Tuesday nights and calls it unwinding. A doctor who's willing to listen, a solid evaluation, and we petition for conservatorship. Once that's granted, we control the financial decisions. Not him. I realized my hand was pressing the cashier's check flat against my sternum. Pressing it hard, as if I needed to confirm it was still there. There's a man, his wife said. A therapist. He's done this before for other families. $1,500 to evaluate. Another $500 for the written recommendation. He's not cheap, but he's fast. $2,000. My son said. To unlock $2.8 million. That's the best return on investment I've ever seen. They both laughed. The sound of it traveled down the hallway and found me standing there, and something that had been soft in my chest for the last 2 years since Linda died finished hardening into something else entirely. I turned around, walked back out the side door, closed it without a sound, got into my truck. Saturday. For a long time, I just sat. 22 years investigating financial fraud teaches you things that are difficult to unlearn. It teaches you that anger is expensive, that confrontation burns evidence, and that the most effective response to discovering a crime is almost never the most emotionally satisfying one. I had watched prosecutors lose airtight cases because a victim confronted the suspect too early and gave them time to move assets, destroy records, and build a defense. I had seen families devastated not just by the original fraud but by their own impulsive reactions to it. I gripped the steering wheel and reminded myself of what I knew. You don't confront them. You document them. You build a case. Then you let the system do what the system exists to do. I pulled out of the street and drove. I didn't have a destination for the first few minutes. I just needed distance and motion and enough quiet to think clearly. Portland slid past my windows. Familiar streets. The city that had been home for most of my adult life. By the time I reached the waterfront, I had a plan. The first call I made was to a man named Dennis Hall. Dennis and I had worked together at the Department of Justice for 11 years before he moved into private investigation. He is 70 now, semi-retired, deeply skeptical of most human beings, and one of the most thorough document investigators I have ever met. He answered on the second ring the way he always does, like he was expecting bad news and had decided to get it over with. "Walter," he said. "I need your help," I said. "I have an active elder fraud conspiracy developing against me, and I'm the target." A pause. Then, "How soon can you be at my office?" Dennis operates out of a converted row house on Belmont, the kind of office that looks like a barely maintained storage unit from the outside and contains, inside, enough surveillance equipment and filing infrastructure to embarrass most law enforcement agencies. He met me at the door with 2 cups of black coffee and the expression he wore during every serious briefing of our working years together. Calm, focused, completely unsentimental. I sat down and told him everything. The conversation I had overheard, the timeline, the mention of the complicit therapist, the conservatorship strategy, the way my son had positioned himself near my laptop 3 weeks ago. Dennis listened without interrupting. He wrote nothing down while I spoke. He never did. He retained information the way other people retain grudges, completely and indefinitely. When I finished, he set down his coffee cup. The conservatorship angle is smart, he said. That's the part that worries me. If they get in front of a judge with fabricated medical documentation before you can counter it, the burden shifts. You'd be proving competence rather than them proving incompetence. That's a harder fight. I know. So we don't let it get that far. He stood and moved to a cabinet on the far wall. Audio equipment. He began selecting devices with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this several thousand times. California is one-party consent. Oregon is also one-party consent for recordings. You can record any conversation you're part of without disclosure. I need the therapist's name, I said. We'll get it. He handed me a small device the size of a flash drive. Clip this inside your collar. Picks up everything within 20 feet. Timestamps automatically. He handed me a second one. Leave this somewhere fixed in the house. Kitchen, living room, wherever they spend most of their time. I looked at the devices in my palm. 30 years ago, this equipment would have filled a briefcase. I need someone at the Portland Police Financial Crimes Unit, I said. I know exactly who, Dennis said. He picked up his phone. An old colleague. She handled 3 conservatorship fraud cases last year, got convictions on all of them. Her name is Lieutenant Voss. I'll call her now. He did. I listened to the half of the conversation I could hear. Professional, efficient, no wasted words. When he hung up, he told me she wanted to meet in person. That evening, before I went back home, we met Lieutenant Voss at Dennis's office at 7 o'clock. She was in her late 40s, short silver hair, the kind of stillness in her manner that comes from years of conducting interviews. She shook my hand and looked me over once, the way investigators assess witnesses, checking for the specific kind of distress that produces unreliable testimony. She seemed satisfied by whatever she found. Tell me what you heard, she said. I told her. She took notes in a small spiral pad, printing rather than writing, the way officers do when they know the notes may become evidence. She asked precise questions. Specific language. Timeline. Whether I had seen the tablet or laptop left unattended. What I knew about the therapist. Whether I had any record of previous conversations. When I finished, she closed the pad. Here is what we need, she said. We need them to take a concrete action. Overheard conversations are difficult in court without corroboration. What we want is the moment money changes hands for the fraudulent evaluation. We want documented contact between your son, his wife, and this therapist. And ideally, we want them to have already taken a step, any step, toward filing for conservatorship. That might happen quickly, I said. They're motivated by the sale number. Good. That works for us. She glanced at Dennis. I'll have a team ready for surveillance starting tomorrow morning. When you go home tonight, Mr. Greer, you behave as though you heard nothing. You are a man who had a good day, a man who sold his business and wants to share the news with his family. Can you do that? I thought about 22 years of fraud investigation, about the faces I had learned to keep neutral in interview rooms, about every moment I had sat across from someone who believed themselves to be the smartest person present. I can do that, I said. The drive home took 20 minutes. I used the time to settle my breathing and reconstruct my expression. By the time I turned onto my street, I had decided who I was going to be for the next 24 hours. Not Walter Greer, fraud investigator, building a case against his own family. I was going to be the man they expected. Trusting, a little emotional about the sale, probably a little lonely, generous with the wine. The clip recorder pressed against my collar. The fixed device was in my jacket pocket, waiting to be placed. My son met me at the door. He looked genuinely glad to see me, which was the most disturbing thing about him. I had been trying for the last hour to locate some early signal I had missed, some tell from the previous months that would have prepared me for the conversation I had overheard. I couldn't find one. He was simply a good actor, or I had been a poor audience. Dad, we were starting to wonder, he said, pulling me into a brief embrace. His wife appeared behind him, smiling. The kitchen smelled like the pasta she makes with the sun-dried tomatoes. She had set the table for 3, a bottle of wine open on the counter. I stepped inside, hung my jacket on the hook by the door. As I turned to face them, I let my fingers trail along the bookshelf edge, and I set the fixed recording device behind the second row of books. 4 seconds. I had done it 1,000 times with less amiable company. I sat down at my own table and let the warmth of the room settle over me like something I deserved. "I have news," I said. My son leaned forward. His wife folded her hands on the table, both of them performing attentiveness, with a fluency that told me they had been performing it for a long time. "The sale went through," I said. "Final number was 2.8 million. I got the check today." The silence lasted exactly 1 second too long. Then my son said, "Dad, that's incredible." And his wife said, "Oh my gosh, Walter." And they both reached across the table, one for my hand, one for my arm, a choreography of celebration that was so smooth it almost fooled me. I let myself look moved. It wasn't entirely performance. The number was real. The 30 years were real. Linda standing at the stove at 5 in the morning for the first 3 years, before we could afford to hire anyone, was real. "I want to do something meaningful with it," I said. "I've been thinking about a charitable trust. Linda's cause. The Cancer Research Foundation she volunteered with. Something lasting." My son's grip on my hand tightened very slightly. "Not enough for anyone to notice who wasn't looking for it." "That's a beautiful idea," his wife said. "But you should take your time. Make sure you're thinking clearly. These decisions are permanent. There's no rush." My son agreed. "You've had a big day. An emotional day. Let's eat and not talk about money tonight." I let them guide the conversation away. I ate pasta and drank 1 glass of wine very slowly, and watched them perform a dinner with the focused attention of someone watching a film they already know the ending of. After the dishes were cleared, my son suggested I relax in the living room while he and his wife cleaned up. I settled into the armchair by the window, opened a book, did not read a single word. From the kitchen, their voices were low, but not low enough. "He's going to do the trust," his wife said. "I know. We move tomorrow. The therapist is at 2. Should I tell him it's a regular checkup? Tell him his blood pressure. He mentioned it last month. He'll believe it. Tell Dr. Parrish it's a family matter. Sensitive. He knows what that means." My son's voice was the quieter of the two. "2,000 for the evaluation. I'll bring cash." The word Parrish landed in my memory like a pin in a map. I had what I needed. I sat in the armchair with my book open, and my face arranged in the expression of a man reading about something mildly interesting, and I sent Dennis a text with one hand held low beside the chair cushion. "Name is Parrish. Likely licensed therapist or psychologist. Portland area. Need address by morning." His reply came in under 4 minutes. "Already on it. Chen wants audio confirmation of tomorrow's logistics before they set up the team. Keep recording tonight." I kept recording. Later, my son brought me decaf coffee. I thanked him and held the mug with both hands and sipped it slowly, watching him, thinking about a morning in 1997 when he was 11 years old and knocked over an entire display of canned goods at the grocery store and stood in the middle of the aisle laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. I had laughed with him. We had picked up every single can together. The coffee tasted fine. Nothing added to it. Whether that was because they hadn't gotten that far in the plan, or because they'd decided it wasn't necessary, I didn't know. I didn't particularly care. I set the mug down half-finished and told them I was tired. My son walked me to the guest room and told me to sleep well. His wife stood in the hallway and said she was glad I'd had a good day. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. I gave them 20 minutes to settle. Then I opened my phone, forwarded the audio files to Dennis and Lieutenant Voss, and sat in the dark thinking about my son at 11 years old and what had changed in 30 years and whether any of it had been my failure to notice or simply a thing that happens to people without anyone being responsible for the slow erosion of who they were supposed to become. I didn't find an answer. I suspected there wasn't one that would have made any difference. At midnight, Dennis sent me Parrish's office address, a building in the Slabtown neighborhood, close enough to several legitimate medical offices to look plausible. far enough from the established clinics that a suspicious person might find the location telling. Lieutenant Voss followed with a message that her team would be in position around the building by 1 in the afternoon, giving them buffer time before the 2 o'clock appointment. I set my phone face down on the nightstand and tried to sleep. I managed some portion of it. My son knocked on the guest room door at 9 the next morning. He was dressed and carrying a cup of coffee for me, which he held out with a smile that was so natural and so practiced that I wondered again if I had simply misheard, if the entire conversation the night before had been something I had constructed in a moment of exhaustion and fear. Then I remembered the word parish, precise and deliberate, and the smile that didn't reach his eyes when I mentioned the charitable trust. I took the coffee. "Dad, we were thinking," he said, settling into the chair near the window, his wife appearing in the doorway behind him. "We should get you a proper checkup. Just baseline stuff. You've been under a lot of stress with the sale. Losing Mom. All of it. Just to have a record of where you are. Health-wise. There's a doctor I know, good reputation. He has a 2 o'clock opening." I held the coffee with both hands. I looked at my son. He held my gaze. "Steady." "Certain. A checkup," I said. "Routine," his wife confirmed from the doorway. "For peace of mind. Ours and yours." I let a beat of silence pass. Then I said, "All right. 2 o'clock. I'll be ready." The relief that crossed both their faces was quick and controlled. But it was there. I had learned, years ago, to watch for the tells that people cannot train themselves out of the fraction of a second drop of tension in the shoulders, the microsecond where the eyes go soft before the expression is reassembled. I had learned to read them in strangers sitting across interrogation tables. It was different, reading them in my son's face. But I read them just the same. We drove to the Slabtown building just after 1:45. My son handled the parking while his wife sat in the back seat next to me, asking about whether I'd thought about where I might travel now that I had the time and the resources. She recommended several places. Her voice was warm. Her hands were folded in her lap in a way that suggested she was working at keeping them still. I did not look for Dennis's car or Lieutenant Voss's surveillance team. I knew they were there, and I knew that looking would risk drawing my son's attention. I simply walked into the building between my son and his wife and climbed the stairs to the second floor. Dr. Parrish's waiting room contained 3 chairs, a small table, and a framed print of a Pacific Northwest landscape that had been chosen for its inoffensiveness. No receptionist, no other patients. The door to the inner office opened quickly, as though Parrish had been watching for us through the gap. He was in his mid-50s, gray suit, reading glasses, the practiced ease of someone who has spent years creating an atmosphere of authority that, examined closely, reveals no actual foundation. He shook my hand with both of his and told me he was glad I had come in, that it was good to be proactive about one's mental health at any stage of life. I sat in the chair he indicated. He asked me questions, straightforward ones at first. How was my sleep? Had I experienced any periods of significant confusion lately? Did I find myself forgetting commitments? I answered everything with slight hesitation, a careful touch of uncertainty in my voice, the performance of a man whose grip on clarity might, under certain lighting, appear to be loosening. My son sat beside me, his wife slightly behind us, both watching Parrish. Parrish took notes. He nodded at the right moments. After 40 minutes, he set his notepad on his knee and turned toward my son and his wife, and began a summary of his observations in the careful language of someone accustomed to delivering conclusions that are not quite lies but are not anything close to the truth. "Mr. Greer is presenting," he said, with indicators consistent with stress-related cognitive disruption. Given his recent significant financial transaction and the compounding grief of spousal loss, it is my professional assessment that independent management of large assets poses a meaningful risk both to Mr. Greer and to those who depend on his good judgment. His wife made a concerned sound. My son's hand rested briefly on my arm. Parrish reached into his desk drawer and produced a form. I could see the heading from where I sat. Cognitive and Functional Assessment. Recommendation for Supervised Financial Management. My son leaned forward in his chair. He reached into his jacket and removed an envelope. "We appreciate your thoroughness, Doctor," he said. As we discussed, he extended the envelope. Parrish's fingers closed around it. For a moment, nothing in the room moved. Then the office door opened. Lieutenant Voss came through first, badge displayed. 2 officers behind her. A 4th officer appeared in the inner doorway that connected to a back hallway, cutting off the only other exit. "Nobody stand up," she said. "Hands where I can see them." Parrish dropped the envelope as though it had burned him. Cash fanned across the desk. Visible. Countable. Impossible to explain away. The officers moved efficiently. My son was on his feet, insisting this was a medical appointment. His wife had gone very still in her chair, which told me she was smarter than he was. Parrish asked for a lawyer 3 times in 30 seconds. I stood up from the chair slowly and watched Lieutenant Voss read my son his rights, and I made myself look at his face throughout, because I believed I owed him that much. Not mercy. Just witness. The decency of not looking away from what we had both arrived at, by different roads, over the course of 41 years. He looked at me once, just before the handcuffs went on. "Dad." His voice had lost its training. Underneath the voice I had been listening to for 30 hours, there was something younger and considerably less certain. "Dad, you don't have to do this. You did this," I said. Not me. It wasn't the most articulate thing I have ever said, but it was the most accurate. Dennis was waiting in the hallway. He gave me one nod. The particular nod we had exchanged across 22 years of cases, when the evidence had held and the charges would stick, and I nodded back. I gave my statement at the precinct that afternoon. 3.5 hours. Every detail documented. The overheard conversation, the recorder files, the envelope, the cash, Parrish's written assessment, the sequence of events that had begun in my own kitchen hallway 48 hours earlier. The officer who transcribed my statement was meticulous and patient. Lieutenant Voss sat in for the first hour to confirm the evidentiary chain. When it was done, she walked me to the building's front entrance. "Parrish's license is being pulled by the state board," she told me. "Your son and his wife are looking at charges under Oregon Revised Statutes 124.1, financial abuse of a vulnerable person, as well as conspiracy and fraud. Given the recorded evidence, the cash in hand, and Parrish's own written documentation, a plea is likely. But if it goes to trial, we're in an excellent position." "What kind of sentence?" I asked. She considered. 3 to 5 years. Parrish likely more. Given the professional violation, the board will ensure he never practices again. I nodded. "You did everything right," she said, "both as an investigator and as a person. That's rarer than it should be." I thanked her and walked out into the gray Portland afternoon. Dennis drove me home. He didn't talk much, which was one of his better qualities. When he pulled up outside my house, he asked if I wanted him to come in. I told him no. He said he'd call in the morning. I told him that was fine. I went inside. The house was quiet in a way it had not been for the past 2 days. A different kind of quiet than the listening quiet of the last 48 hours. This was simply empty. My son's jacket was still on the hook by the door. His wife had left a paperback face down on the coffee table. Small traces of a visit that had been one thing when it started, and had become something else entirely by the time it ended. I stood in the kitchen and made coffee. Real coffee, not decaf. Because I was not going to sleep for a while, and I had decided to stop pretending otherwise. I poured a mug and stood at the window, and looked at the backyard where Linda had kept a garden for 20 years, and where I had let everything but the rosemary go wild since she died. The check was still in my jacket pocket. I had been carrying it for 2 days. I set the mug down and called my bank and arranged to have the funds deposited and secured. Then I called the attorney who had helped Linda and me update our will 3 years ago. I told her I needed a new trust document drafted. Not the charitable trust I had mentioned at dinner. Not yet, but a structural document first. Something that formalized my intentions and closed the openings my son had identified and planned to walk through. She told me she could have a draft by Tuesday. After that, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and did not call anyone else. There was no one left to call that night who would have understood what the evening required, which was simply the bearing of it. The trial was scheduled for 7 months later. My son accepted a plea in the 5th month, 3 years, with the possibility of parole at 18 months, dependent on restitution and demonstrated rehabilitation. His wife took a separate plea for a reduced sentence given her more limited role. Parrish received 5 years and the permanent revocation of his license. Oregon's Adult Protective Services opened an expanded investigation into similar cases in which he had been involved as an evaluator, and found 4 others with similar patterns. I testified once, at the sentencing hearing. My son sat 20 feet away and looked at the table in front of him for most of it. When the judge asked if I had a statement for the court, I kept it brief. I said that the law was not a substitute for the relationship I had lost, but that its absence would have been a second loss on top of the first, and that I was grateful for a system that treated the truth as something worth the effort of establishing. The judge thanked me for my cooperation and for the quality of the evidence. I nodded and sat back down. After the hearing, Dennis met me in the parking lot. He looked the same as he always had. Unhurried, unsentimental, with the specific kind of patience that comes from watching human beings fail each other so many times that the failure stops being surprising and becomes simply a feature of the landscape you have learned to work within. "You gonna be all right, Walter?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Eventually, I said, "That's the honest answer. It is." We walked to our separate cars in the April rain and drove in separate directions back into the city that had been home to both of us for most of our lives. I stopped for groceries on the way. Basic things. I had been letting that slide lately, and I had decided, sometime between the sentencing hearing and the parking lot, that I was going to stop letting things slide that didn't need to slide. I was 68 years old. I had money in the bank and a house that needed its back garden attended to, and 30 years of knowing how to be useful in the world that didn't evaporate simply because the last 2 years had been what they had been. I got home and put the groceries away. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I called the Cancer Research Foundation where Linda had volunteered. I told them I wanted to discuss establishing a named fund. They put me through to someone in development, a woman with a careful, grateful voice, and I asked her what amount would make a meaningful difference to the work they were doing. She told me. I told her I could do that. I wrote it down on the notepad by the phone the way I had been writing things down for 40 years. Date, amount, a purpose, and I set the pen down and looked at Linda's handwriting still visible on the top edge of the pad from a grocery list she had written 2.5 years ago, before either of us knew there was anything to worry about. Apples, it said. The good kind. I went to the window. The backyard was wet from the rain, the wild garden catching the last of the afternoon light in the way overgrown things do, indiscriminately, without preference. I stood there for a while watching it, not thinking about anything in particular. Just standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, with the light coming in and the work, at least for today, done. Outside, somewhere across the city, the law was continuing to function, the way it does when it functions imperfectly, incompletely, but in the general direction of consequence, meeting action. And inside, in the quiet of my kitchen, I was beginning the slow work of deciding what the rest of this life was going to be. It would take longer than a single evening. I knew that. Some things take as long as they take, and the wishing them faster only delays the actual process of moving through them. But I was a patient man. 22 years of fraud investigation will do that to you. You learn that the truth has its own timeline, and the best you can do is prepare yourself. Document everything, and trust that what is built carefully tends, in the end, to hold. I went to bed that night before 9 o'clock. I slept straight through until morning.